Hi, I'd just like to welcome everyone back for the second part of today's conference, Resonance and Transmission, from one voice to another. We have two fantastic talks coming up, one by the artist Alex Martinez Roe and the other by the art historian Francesco Ventrella. Their talks will also be followed by a conversation. So first up, I'd like to invite Alex Martinez Roe to speak. Her current research projects and exhibitions explore feminist genealogies using a variety of media, including film, audio installations, performance, and text. She's exhibited widely, both in Europe and internationally, including a story from, I'm going to say this wrong now, Secolo della Rosa at Archive Cabinet in Berlin, New 13 at the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art in Melbourne, Australia, Wahala at Savvy Contemporary in Berlin, and Non-Writing Histories at Artspace in Sydney, Australia. Also, as I mentioned at the start of the day, Alex convened If I Can't Dance's Summer Opening Reading Group for this Appropriation and Dedication edition, which was a catalyst for the thinking around today's program. As well, on a more personal note, Alex was also a key interlocutor and participant in the curatorial project I ran in Sydney Society with an exhibition, Autobiography of a Collective. Since 2009, she has lived and worked at Kunsthaus Kula in Berlin and is currently a fellow at the Graduate School for Art and Science at UDK in Berlin. Today, Alex will be introducing her practice and methodologies, including her recent oral history research around the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective, as well as the practice of acknowledging other voices within, with and in her own, to affirm a female authorial genealogy. So over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Susan. So before I begin, I'd just like to thank Susan again and the If I Can't Dance team, Frederic, Vivian and Tanya, and also Gabriëlle and Jort and the Rietveld Academie for inviting me to Amsterdam for this event. And I'd also like to thank Francesco Ventrella for our wonderful dialogue in the lead up to today. So I've titled my presentation, The Voices Within My Own. And I'm going to talk about the way I've developed a practice of resonating with other voices as a feminist approach to authorship in 4 different projects. Coming from within my broader project of attempting to make my actions responsible to others in their difference, this practice of resonating traces my desire to expand my authorship as an artist by acknowledging the other voices that were and always become a part of it, but at the same time, without losing my voice. This practice of resonating attempts to trouble the normative model of solo authorship in the art world and its performative role in the construction of capitalist individualism. Attempting this expansion has necessarily come up against so many problems of representation. How could I include other people's voices audibly within my own without colonizing them? This is the key question that runs through the projects I'll discuss. These are questions a feminist, post-colonial, historian, documentarian, or ethnographer must ask, and now artists working with participatory practices must ask them too. And there are no easy answers. Negotiating and responding to these problems has been an integral aspect of my attempts to include other voices other than my own in my work. For this conversation transcript called Stenotype, I arranged for 2 participants who had not yet seen each other since participating in another of my artworks, but who knew each other, to meet in the gallery before opening hours to discuss their experience. I wanted to address my desire to bring others into my artistic process. I wanted to test the possibility of including my audience within what we understand as the artwork, without trying to hide my role in constructing the situation. I employed a stenographer to simultaneously transcribe the conversation these 2 people had during my exhibition. Their discussion was private except for the silent presence of the stenographer. A stenographer records syllables, not letters, and so I imagined that perhaps the way she might listen to their discussion might be different, particularly as she had no prior knowledge to the project, of the project or the context of the gallery. And you see that the way she moves her fingers is quite slow, unlike typing. It has this kind of silent slowness to it. As the stenographer presses each syllable key on the Stenotype machine, a roll of steno paper is simultaneously stamped with the corresponding stenography symbol. This paper emerges from the machine as an unequivocal record of the syllables the stenographer has heard. I scanned the roll of steno paper after their conversation and then compiled it into A1 blocks of code. The 45-minute discussion filled 5.5 sheets. I then presented this pinned to the wall along with an audio recording of the inside of the Stenotype machine, which is padded and inaudible to the naked ear. Along with the, and then I presented that along with the silent video focused on the stenographer. So together these 3 documents form an expanded transcript of the conversation. The contact microphone captured the usually inaudible mechanical movement of the printer as it recorded the stenographic code. Oh, that's going to open in iTunes. Whoops. Or maybe that's okay. Sorry. So Stenotype was a way to represent the foreclosed content of the participants' conversation about their experiences of my work, troubling the politics of documentation that attempts to give transparent access to an event. But it was also an attempt to set up some conditions under which their thoughts about my work and their participation in it might be shared. That is, through organising private conversations among willing participants. This was an exploration of an ethics that prevented me from publicly sharing content that was not mine. And it led me to a kind of impasse. How could I trouble the model of the solo author if I could not include other voices within my own? Collaboration is one answer, I think, but I also wanted to find a way to critique the continuing organisation of the art world around the individual artist and its corollary, the autonomous subject. So by finding a way to expand our understanding of selfhood to one that is, to use philosopher Adriana Cavarero's language, unique and relational. The stenographer seemed to be the very image of femininity, with her inaudible, illegible language of listening. I chose to document her activity and participation as a way to record the parameters of the conversation itself and the sexual politics of the relationship between events and documents, speech and text. Let's explore this association of the stenographer with femininity. She records the sounds she hears, producing an illegible code. She does not contribute to the conversation, but instead listens to the sounds, regardless of whether or not she knows their meaning. She does not participate in language, but becomes its necessary other. This role as the other, according to the philosopher Lawrence Abu Hamdan, prevents any real difference from becoming part of language. That is, ways of meaning differently from different embodiments. Because the feminine, the other, acts as a mime, a mirror of the speaker, the masculine. Language and speech are thus universalized, always mirroring the same masculinity, which appears as neutral. We don't notice this universalism, this sameness, as masculine. Words appear to be neutral things that a speaker uses. According to Adriana Cavarero, this apparent neutrality, which is really a masculinity and which dominates signification, this universal masculinity is an effect of the separation of the voice from speech. Cavarero has explored the classical association of the voice with femininity, and I quote, "The woman appears first of all as a body and as an inarticulate voice. She must be beautiful, but she must not speak. What she can do, however, is emit pleasing sounds, asemantic vocalizations, moans of pleasure. In the symbolic patriarchal order, man is conceived as mind and woman as body. In the division of the logos into a purely feminine phone and a purely masculine semanticon, that division finally accomplishes and confirms the system." End quote. Since this conversation transcript, I would say that my work over the last couple of years has been an attempt to, quote, revocalize the logos, end quote. In other words, I see my projects as attempts to bring the specificity of each voice back into language. Cavarero begins her philosophy of vocal expression from the simple observation that every voice is unique and unrepeatable, that we can recognize someone just by hearing her voice. A simple example is the common beginning to a phone conversation between close friends or relations. "Hello," and the reply, "It's me." That uniqueness of every voice has been excluded from our understanding of language. The word hello is understood as separate from the voice who speaks it. Cavarero situates this condition culturally and historically. This condition of speech, as separated from the unique voice that speaks it, has come about in the Greek tradition. Cavarero looks to the Hebrew tradition for a different understanding, where one who speaks in her uniqueness is always in the meaning of what is said. And now, returning for a little bit of critique to the trope of the seductive, lethal, and wordless feminine voice, the siren, to use one of Cavarero's examples, the siren, the mythical feminine creature who is erotic, dangerous, and outside of language. I think that the title of this 4-day program, Voice, Creature of Transition, actually risks confirming this devocalization of language. Voice in this title is in the singular. It is a universal voice, not plural voice, unique voices. And I also take issue with the use of the word creature as precisely non-human, and as the voice is also in this Greek tradition non-human, or the animal body. I fear that the title reinscribes these oppositions between the human and the non-human, the voice and speech, and thus confirms its association with femininity, a femininity that is excluded from language. In the figuration of creatures like the sirens, the possibility of real difference, not just more mirrored reflections, the possibility of the feminine as a real difference in our culture is erased. Following Stenotype, I embarked on a number of projects which sought to create situations where my audience became my interlocutors. I wanted to negotiate these situations directly with people who were no longer on the outside of my projects looking in, but engaging directly with me to construct conditions under which I could bring their unique voices ethically into my work. I set out to explore my female authorial genealogy as a way to make artworks that foregrounded my co-emergence with and contingencies upon other authorships. I contacted many people who had already participated in projects of mine or who had discussed them at length with me I now refer to these people as interlocutors. And I asked each of these people to nominate a female author who'd been important to her or him. In this first phase of my project, Genealogies Frameworks for Exchange, I facilitated a series of online video conference encounters between these writers and readers, which were recorded and then edited in consultation with the participants afterwards. This meant that the participants didn't have to think about other audiences while conversing, as they knew that they would be involved in the editing process, and that it was entirely possible for them to decide to make none of that content public. In telling stories, one of these edited recordings, Razia Paveen, who was at that time a doctoral candidate in English literature at Huddersfield University in the UK, and who'd participated in one of my projects, nominated Wendy Webster, Professor Emeritus of Contemporary British History at the University of Central Lancashire, as a key figure in her research. In fact, Paveen is part of a migrant community in North England from South Asia, which is one of the demographics that Webster has written about in the book, which was so important for Paveen, called Imagining Home. I then contacted Webster and asked if she would meet with Paveen on Skype. It was then by chance that Webster happened to visit Paveen's institution, and so they actually met in person. They met me on Skype, and we discussed the parameters of the conversation. I then left my computer, so I was not present during their conversation, but my computer recorded their encounter. The editing and presentation of the piece was done in consultation with them afterwards. I'll just play a short excerpt from Telling Stories now.
Right, how would you like to begin?
Probably the best starting point is for you to talk about what you're doing, isn't it?
Right. Okay. What I'm looking at is the role of women in literature, which has migrated, subaltern literature, which has migrated from South Asia to Lockwood, which is a locality in Huddersfield. So
that's an interesting idea in itself,
yes,
about literature migrating,
yes, literature,
as well as people.
Yes.
So when you say literature,
I'm talking about certain things like songs, recipes, herbal remedies, oral tales. So it's oral history. It's history that has been that is living in diaspora. You know, and it's not people, it's just women that I'm looking at.
Yes.
I'm looking at the role of women in the domestic sphere and the maintenance of literature in that domestic sphere.
So when you say literature,
mm-hmm,
you're sort of looking at an oral tradition, mm-hmm, and thinking of that as a form of literature.
Yes, yes.
So this isn't written down type literature.
So that's very...
Which is another sort of quite interesting way of using, because literature, people always assume you're talking about the thing.
Yes, so absolutely. In one of Spivak's essays, she asks, can the subaltern speak? And who has the right to speak on their behalf? And for me, that is a very interesting question, because it pulls together the idea that no one can speak on behalf of the subaltern. And if you are going to speak, and you're not speaking for the subaltern. Nobody can speak for the subaltern apart from the subaltern. And once it is in a written form, then it becomes something different. It turns into a completely different monster altogether. So,
because going back to the oral history things and doing interviews with people, because I don't know how important that is in what you're doing, but I did a lot of interviews in writing Imagining Home. Yes. And then after that I did some work on refugees who came to Bradford, and Huddersfield as well. But but that I mainly based that on interviews that had already been done, and I listened to tapes. There's some in Huddersfield Public Library and there's some in Bradford Public Library, and read transcripts and things. So I did quite a lot of oral history for about, I don't know, 5 years or something. And then I got more and more feeling that interviewing itself is quite an exploitative thing to do.
The full video is 15 minutes. So I see that in cases like Razia and Wendy's, who've both participated in 2 projects of mine, that I'm building a network of participants who are not collaborators or audience members, but people with whom I have an ongoing exchange that is negotiated in terms of its effects. In Stenotype and other works, I did not disclose content from the encounters I'd facilitated because I had not devised a way of to bring each voice into the work in respect of its uniqueness. In this project, I found that mapping the participants' differing connections to my own authorship, I mean the way that the interlocutors and the authors important to them had affected my way of working, meant that I could bring the language created in one of my architectures for encounter into the exhibition situation. Now I'm going to talk a bit about the politics of relations between generations of feminists. Since many young activists from the 1970s are now established academics, and many feminist activists work in academia or the arts, I felt that it would be particularly useful to look at the generational relations between feminist academics and thus authors. In the Genealogies project, I was particularly curious to unpack the quality of textual relations between different generations of feminists and to see how these relations played out on an interpersonal level. Some of these meetings have created positive connections between people who had never met. Sadly, however, I felt that in many cases where young female academics had been taught by formidable senior feminists, that they felt ultimately rejected and were unwilling to make contact again as part of my project. And many of my interlocutors expressed fear in meeting authors who had been important to them. The sensitivity and vulnerability of these intergenerational relations seems to me to reflect the problems of a patriarchal or phallocentric order, which Adrienne Rich and Irigaray describe as producing relationships of rivalry between women because their differences are not acknowledged, which leads to a lack of relationships among women. My concern about the relations between different generations of feminists is a concern for the political importance of building a culture of difference. To do that, to have a culture where the unique difference of every voice is inextricable from the ways in which meaning is made, then we need to gather the work that has already been done towards this. So, for example, different feminist movements. We need to be able to gather that history without reducing its intricacies in order to create trajectories for our own work. Therefore, we need to practice our politics of relations carefully so that our meanings are contextualised and understood in the ways they want to be. The importance of the politics of relations among feminists has, in part, come from my engagement with Italian and French theory practices of sexual difference, in particular from the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective, and what they call the practice of relations, which is a political practice of spending time and energy on relations with other women, giving them the authority to speak in the social spheres they desire to participate in. In particular, I think that the way they practice and theorise relations, the way that they practice and theorise relations of what they call affidamento, which translates as entrustment, has enormous potential for collective practices. Affidamento is a social symbolic practice that has been exercised and theorised by the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective since the mid-1970s. And it describes a reciprocal relationship of entrustment between 2 adult women, primarily. By referring to one another, each gives the other authority in her spheres of political practice by acknowledging her desires, competences, and differences. This practice of acknowledgement involves a commitment to one another, and that's a commitment to each other's sexual difference. Working with the differences between women affirms the sexual difference of each member of the collective, which becomes its actual mode of organisation. I see the potential of affidamento in its traversal of boundaries of belonging. As it relies on differences rather than sameness, it is not a political relationship based on similar identities, nor on ideology. It is a commitment and openness to another in her radical, irreducible difference, her uniqueness, and at the same time, a way of working on common projects. I see it as a way to create connections and networks, communities and cultures of difference. After the Genealogies Frameworks for Exchange project, where I'd organised those conversations, in that project, I had taken the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective's text on affidamento as a starting point. So after that project, I realised that I wanted to do what my participants in the project had done. I wanted to meet these people, the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective, who had been so important to my work. I had the idea that I would like to acknowledge them as important figures in my female authorial genealogy and in my work in some way. And I also wanted to learn more about the lived practice of affidamento. So I went to meet with the collective and I asked them if they could devise, if we together could devise an equivalent gesture to them signing my copy of their book, which was after all how I'd come to their ideas and practices. We talked about the unsuitability of the signature in performing this gesture. The collective must be multi-voiced and yet specific. I proposed to record them reading my favourite excerpts from their book, and we all felt that was a good solution. They found a new copy of their book in Italian and opened it to my favourite pages, which give historical examples of affidamento. We marked the sections in pencil, and then the four of us went down into the cellar to record it. You can see here how later I installed the audio recording using a directional speaker, which creates a tunnel of sound for one listener. The scrolling text projection that accompanies the audio recording, which together are called A Gift of Acknowledgement, is an English translation of these stories of affidamento, the stories of Demeter and Persephone, and the Enlightenment Salonières, Madame du Deffand and Mademoiselle de l'Espinasse, for example. I'll just play a small section from that.
Deffand, secolo XVIII, ebbe per lungo tempo il salotto più celebre di Parigi. Nel Settecento il salotto era un luogo di potere e di piacere delle donne, più di quanto noi possiamo immaginare oggi, perché in quel secolo anche la politica degli uomini si basava sui rapporti personali, e i rapporti erano un luogo strategico delle trame politiche. Non per molto ancora, stavano infatti nascendo i partiti e altre forme di organizzazione della politica. In Francia, a Parigi, sta nascendo il partito dei filosofi, gli illuministi. Madame du Deffand lo osteggia. Condivide buona parte delle loro idee, è amica di molti dei filosofi, specialmente di Voltaire, ma è contraria al loro partito che sfugge al suo raggio d'azione come al suo modo di intendere la politica. Benedetta Graveri, autrice di un approfondito studio storico su Madame du Deffand e il suo mondo, ci racconta a un certo punto le manovre complesse e sottili che Madame du Deffand dispiegò per far venire a Parigi come sua dama di compagnia una figlia illegittima del fratello, Mademoiselle de l'Espinasse, che l'aveva affascinata per la sua intelligenza e sensibilità. Racconta poi la storia del loro rapporto durato 10 anni e della sua rottura determinata dal fatto che la giovane donna, andando contro la volontà della sua protettrice, si incontrava per suo conto con D'Alembert e altri del Partito dei Filosofi. Madame du Deffand era la continuatrice di una tradizione di sapere e di prestigio femminile, che si erano formati nel tempo a partire da altre grandi signore, come Madame de Lafayette e Madame de Sévigné. La ribellione di Mademoiselle de Lespinasse interrompe quella tradizione, da lei non capita più che rifiutata. Con lei incomincia la lunga serie non ancora conclusa di donne intelligenti e appassionate che combattono per una causa o per un ideale quasi sempre giusti, ma senza rapporto con le ragioni del loro sesso. Le sante Terese fondatrici di nulla, come le chiama George Eliot. Tra la vecchia dama...
Apologies, there's a kind of technical glitch there. It's usually nice and smooth. Let me just go back. So afterwards, the Bookstore Collective gave me this new copy that we'd read from of the book as a gift, and I placed my English copy of their book and this new copy in Italian side by side in a frame based on the bookstore's front window display, which is kind of like a motif that they've used since 1975. The piece is called To Be Two, To Become Two. These two works operate like an extended footnote for another piece called The Practice of Doing. For The Practice of Doing, I went searching for stories of affidamento, and I collected 22 audio recordings of all sorts of people in different countries, male and female, with different types of knowledge, some academic and some popular cultural. And they were all telling short stories of around 2 or 3 minutes long each of relationships between women or people referred to using the pronoun she. And in each of these relationships, these people have referred to one another publicly in their work, and as a result have achieved something extraordinary or unusual. In some cases, these are relations of affidamento, and in others, they are gestures that open the possibility for that kind of relationship. This audio track is the same on each set of the headphones and goes for 47 minutes. And so to give you a few examples of these stories, someone describes how journalist Marie Maloney's campaign in women's magazines to fund scientist Marie Curie's research facilitated some of her important work. Another person tells of the poems the Australian poets Udguru Nunakal and Judith Wright wrote to one another. Someone else talks about no-wave artists Vivian Dick and Lydia Lunch and the films they made together. Another voice recounts the campaign led by development activist Graça Machel to elect Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Nigerian finance minister, to be the chair of the World Bank, which was unsuccessful. I'm now just going to play one of these recordings. It's told by a historian who recently published a biography on Virginia Woolf, and it tells the story of Woolf's relationship with the author Vita Sackville-West.
Well, they met after Virginia published Jacob's Room, which was her third novel, or the first in her own voice, as she put it. And Vita was very complimentary about the novel, and she asked to have a bit of an audience with Virginia, and they had a chat about it, and they didn't, well, Virginia didn't think that much of Vita when she first met her. Virginia was quite jealous when Vita won a prize for her long poem, The Land, and she thought that Vita's work was not as good as hers. She was also very jealous of Vita because she was more of a, what she called more of a woman than she was. She was a mother and a lover of various men and women, largely women, and a wife, and very busy, and she would travel. And Virginia was very much, well, she was more of a home bird. She didn't have children, and her life, she felt, was in some ways lacking. But they got on very well, and they did have a love affair at one point. Virginia was notoriously cold sexually, So I don't think the relationship was very fulfilling in that regard for either of them, and it ended up being more of a friendship, which lasted until Virginia's death, although they did drift apart, even though Vita was the first person other than family members that was told about Virginia's suicide in the end. The Hogarth Press was set up by Leonard and Virginia Woolf as a means to publish their own work, and they managed to coax Vita into publishing one of her novels with them, which of course was a bestseller. I think it was called Seducers in Ecuador. So the Hogarth Press earned quite a lot of money. They hadn't made an awful lot of money until that point, really, because the fiction they were publishing was too experimental. I mean, when they first met, Virginia said, I have a little quote actually about what her first impressions, if I can find it. Oh yes, here it is. She said of Vita, not much to my severer taste, florid, moustached, parakeet-coloured, with all the subtle ease of the aristocracy, but not the wit of the artist. She writes 15 pages a day, has finished another book, publishes with Heinemann's, knows everyone, but could I ever know her? And she leaves that with a question mark, and that was, she wrote that in 1922, and then by 1924 she was saying things like, Vita's a perfect lady with dash and courage, and she's not just a mother, a wife, a great lady, a hostess, but she's also an authoress. Woolf's novel Orlando, which was written about Vita, where Vita is transformed into this 16th century nobleman at the court of Elizabeth I, and she charts the life of this nobleman called Orlando, who changes sex about halfway through the novel. So she becomes a she, and this man lives for 400 years, and we end the novel in about 1928 when the book was published.
So, just go back. The practice of doing is a collection of stories. I think stories are a particularly good way of creating affirmative relations between generations of feminists, because their specificity avoids the potential universalisms, the potential violence of theory. That is because a story is tied to the narrator and because she recounts specific events. The situated knowledge of stories has been very important for feminism. Autocoscienza groups in the late 1960s and early 1970s in Italy, which were similar to consciousness-raising groups in the Anglophone world, were the first of what the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective calls speech groups. Small groups of women would meet and listen to each other speak about their experiences in in private and social spheres. This was necessary for each woman in the movement to gain awareness of herself through others and to start her knowledge from her own experiences, rather than from the knowledge that is validated by patriarchal culture. Adriana Cavarero sees biographical narration as an important political act because it creates a sense of self that is inherently relational. This idea comes in part from her experience with consciousness-raising groups, which is a scene in which the self is exposed to others who, in their reciprocal listening and storytelling, recognise that self as unique, but only in that action of revealing itself to others. That narratable self is not like the subject in that it has none of those key characteristics like interiority or autonomous agency. The uniqueness of the narratable self makes no bifurcation of inside and outside. Cavarero describes this as a uniqueness that is always external. What is essential for Cavarero is not what is narrated, but the person's desire for her or his life story. The desire for one's life story is the desire for unity, but that unity is not a fantasy of a coherent identity, but rather an unstable, fleeting unity of one's uniqueness and selfhood, a story that only others can tell, but which is a story for that person. The disjunction between discourse and life, between the interpolation of what one is and lived experience, is both suspended by relational narrative practices, which can, I'll say that I'll say that again. The disjunction between discourse and life, between the interpolation of what one is and lived experience, is suspended by relational narrative practices, which can bring about a shift in both. The importance of narrative storytelling to housewives is felt in the story which originally appeared in the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective's book Non credere di avere dei diritti, Don't Think You Have Any Rights, of Amalia and Emilia, who attended the 150 hours school for housewives in the 1970s. Amalia, who is sick of her friend always repeating stories about her life, writes Emilia's life story for her on a few sheets of paper. This is a gift that Emilia then carries around in her purse ever afterward and reads incessantly with great emotion. As Cavareiro writes, Emilia has lived life in which her uniqueness has remained partially unexposed due to the lack of a shared scene of co-appearance, the lack of a true political space. End quote. I think it's important to note that perhaps the urgency and desire for one's life story is felt most by those who have least access to this space of appearance, to politics, which Cavareiro defines via Arendt as spaces of self-exhibition and co-appearance with others. And as such, relational storytelling as a political practice has a particular grassroots quality. I'll just mention here that the very project of the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective is to create a space for such co-appearance with other women, but which is open to the public and thus participates in the social life of the city. So after making this work about relations of affidamento, I felt that this important history of Italian feminist storytelling practices, of which there are many, should be shared so that their methodologies can migrate into new contexts. I felt that a kind of collective biography of the lived relations and practices of the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective would be a wonderful way to do that. I recently spent a month going to the bookstore every other day and meeting with various women there to learn about these histories. And with this idea of making a collective biography in mind, I realised quite quickly, though, that it would not be possible to make a kind of representative biography of the collective as a whole. I realised that it was in the minor stories, the specific stories, that I would find a way to tell my own. So now I'm going to show a short film called A Story from Circolo della Rosa that I made there, which traces the story of two experimental historians, Mariri Martinengo and Laura Minguzzi, who began working together on feminist pedagogical experiments in the late 1980s and explores the nature of their relationship, which can be described as one of affidamento. So learning about their story, I realised that I had found the two women in the collective who had worked the most on the practice of doing history, as they call it. And thus these practices, which are the subject of the film, also shaped the modality of actually making it. So I undertook to make my film in a way that resonated with what they call their practice of living history. The practice of living history is a relational practice of storytelling in a speech group where historians listen to one another's narrations and offer interpretations which then shape the way the history is written. In addition, it blurs what have previously been considered the distinct disciplines of history and autobiography, as the embodied and empirical knowledge of the historian is written into the situated knowledge that they call living history. My approach to making the film was to listen to their stories and then to seek out the spaces where significant events that shaped their relationship occurred, and to explore archival traces. So these spaces I went to are now mostly very different from what they were. And when I visited these places, I imagined the events that had taken place there, which got me thinking about the future. How could these spaces be used now? What could we do there? I wrote a letter to my interlocutors with whom I share a relation of affidamento. I wrote a letter telling my story, which is also Laura and Mariri's story. The title is A Story from Circolo della Rosa, and I'll just play it now.
My dear, I have been searching for stories to help explain the way I see our relationship. Stories from the history of the political practice of relations. It has led me to the places where the women who theorized it still practice it. I have been speaking with two women in particular, and I found myself outside the building where they first met, trying to guess which of the shop fronts used to be the bookstore. They met each other there a few years after the Yellow Catalogue, The Mothers of Us All, a compilation of texts about women authors, had been published. One of them had written about the Bronte sisters. She's the older of the two, and when they first got to know each other, she was already well known in their circles for her work on the pedagogy of sexual difference. They would see each other often at the Thursday meetings at the bookstore. Even though the younger woman lived in a different city, she would often travel to be there. Around that time, she heard the older woman give an inspiring speech on a 2-year program she had implemented into the curriculum of a high school, where for an hour each week, all students were separated into female and male groups for a special class on sexual difference. She was very taken by her, not only because she was an important thinker and activist in the movement, but because she had so much elegance, grace, and beauty. They joked that the younger one, coming from a peasant background, desired in some way to be bourgeois, and that is, in part, why she found the older woman so appealing. Sometime later, the older woman organized a seminar for teachers at the Center for Educational Innovation and Experimentation on the pedagogy of sexual difference. The building where the center was located is now offices of the fashion house Dolce & Gabbana. The younger woman, coming from a communist family, was a scholar of Russian literature and at that time also a language teacher, and began commuting to attend the seminar. As a condition of participation, teachers had to sign up in pairs. They had to bring someone with them. And since she was living in a different city, she had no colleagues she could invite. The woman who ran the seminar solved this problem by becoming her partner. Every Thursday night, after the seminar, they would walk together to the weekly meetings of the bookstore's new club, Circolo della Rosa. And after the formal discussions and presentations, she would sit opposite her at the dinner table and try to engage her in conversation. Her desire came not only from the high esteem in which she held the other, but because she was seeking a certain kind of political relationship with another woman. At first, the older woman didn't really notice the other's desire to form a special relationship with her. After some time, the younger woman showed her commitment to the project by organizing to be transferred to a school in the same city as the Center for Educational Experimentation, and moved into an apartment shared with other women without telling her husband in advance. After all, she had been transferred. During the seminar, which was held in a library, they studied literature, reading for ways to make sexual difference visible and legible. The participants then integrated what they had learned in the seminar into their existing teaching curricula, adapting the ideas to whichever subject they were teaching. The younger woman engaged her students in analyses of the way gender is used in Russian and French language, and gave them research projects on Russian and French female poets, artists, philosophers, linguists, and political figures. The seminar, which ran for 3 years, along with their teaching experiments, established a very close relationship between the two women, and the younger woman became frightened by her dependence on the other. When she criticized her, she would feel it as a sharp pain in her stomach. In the years that followed, in addition to the weekly meetings of Circolo della Rosa, they, along with the others from the collective, would go for weekends to Monforte d'Alba, staying at the older woman's family manor house. There, they would have meetings and dinners, often with people from other collectives, working together on various projects and issues. They would also go for walks, exploring the countryside, enjoying the time with one another. Over time, the younger woman grew stronger and easier in their relationship. She was no longer dependent on the other woman's approval. They had entrusted themselves to one another, and the older woman had become her point of reference in the world. And in turn, she had given the older woman the authority to do her work. Around this time, the older woman gave up teaching and focused on her true passion, history. She organized a working group on the historiography of sexual difference, which not only sought to create a history, but to examine the way in which history is told, and to establish a careful practice of storytelling. The younger woman hated history, the story of men and aristocrats. But in a move that showed the older woman the depth of her commitment, she joined the working group, dedicating herself to historical research. They both went on to write extensively on women's medieval history. For example, the younger woman worked on the history of a Belarusian abbess in the 12th century, and the older woman researched practices of love in the medieval era. She says the women's movement of the 20th century can find its roots there. Among the figures in her recent research are the medieval women of Monforte d'Alba, whose stories she tells weaved within her own and those she encountered over the years in the town. Now they work together on what they call living histories, starting with personal experiences that become history through a process of listening to one another. I met them there, where they still meet every Thursday, in the Circolo della Rosa. A curious thing before I end is that some years ago now, when I met with the philosopher of sexual difference, Lawrence Abu Hamdan, to talk to her about my interest in the architecture of encounters, she recommended that I work with a pedagogy of sexual difference. Meeting these two women has given that conversation a new sense, and I feel that perhaps now I have found a way of acting on her advice.
So thanks for your attention, and sorry for the technical glitch with the video.